The surveyor came out on a Tuesday morning in April of 1987 to establish the property corners for Cal Mercer's loan application, and he walked the whole 118 acres in about 3 hours. He was methodical and fast, the way men who have done the same work for 20 years tend to be. And when he came to the sycamore tree standing in the middle of the property, he looked at it for a moment, wrote something on his clipboard, and kept moving. Cal was following along, and he asked what he'd written. "Dead tree," the surveyor said. He looked up at the canopy, which was sparse and pale, and at the trunk, which showed a hollow on the south side about 4 feet up and bark peeling away in plates over most of the upper third. "This one's finished," he said. Cal would want to take it down before he ran any fence near it, and that he'd marked it as a hazard on the plat. Cal looked at the tree. "How long has it been dead?" he asked. The surveyor glanced up again. "Long enough that it shouldn't still be standing," he said, and moved on to the next corner. Cal stood there another minute before he followed. He had bought the 118 acres the previous October for a price low enough that the county extension office had raised its eyebrows when he filed the deed. The land had not been farmed seriously since the early 1970s. The farmhouse was gone, only the foundation remaining. The barn was partially standing, with one side wall down and the roof sound over the eastern 2/3. There were old fence rows and cedar lines and a kitchen garden area that had grown back to grass and dockweed and a row of hedge apple trees along the south boundary. The county description of the property included a line that appeared on almost every listing in that part of Ozark County. No well of record, no pond, no developed livestock water. People in the township called it dry ground, and they had been calling it that for years. Cal had bought it anyway because he needed somewhere to put 14 calves, and nowhere else in his price range had a barn roof that held. For 2 weeks after the surveyor's visit, the sycamore sat on his mind, not because of anything the surveyor had said, because of what Cal had noticed while the surveyor was talking, which was that the tree had leaves, not many, concentrated in the upper branches on the northwest side of the canopy, a cluster of pale green that should not have been there if the tree was as far gone as it looked. A dead tree did not put out leaves in April. A dying tree might, on the side that had the most access to whatever it was still drawing on. He did not think about this analytically at first. He filed it away the way a man filed away things that did not fit the obvious explanation, and he went back to fencing. A week after the surveyor's visit, Cal was running his brush cutter along the north side of the sycamore's root zone when the cutter hit a soft spot and the right wheel dropped 2 inches into the ground before finding purchase and coming back up. He stopped and got off the machine. The ground where the wheel had dipped was darker than the surrounding soil, visibly so, the way soil looked when it held moisture that the topsoil around it did not. He pressed the back of his hand against it. It was cool, not cold, but measurably cooler than the dirt 3 feet away. He got a spade from the truck and dug down 8 inches. He found no water. What he found was damp soil of a darker color, packed clay that had been holding moisture from somewhere, and below it, what felt like a harder layer he couldn't break into easily with the spade. He filled the hole back in and thought about it. Over the next week, he started paying attention to the root system in a different way than a man usually paid attention to tree roots. The sycamore's surface roots were visible across a wide radius from the trunk. Most went in all directions, which was normal, but 3 of the larger roots, each as thick as a man's forearm, departed the trunk in roughly the same compass direction, west-northwest. Not clustered together, but parallel, spaced about 18 inches apart, running through the soil like slow-moving rivers, choosing the same course without touching. Cal drove a wooden stake where each root disappeared underground. When he stretched a string between the stakes and extended the line, it pointed at a point about 70 feet northwest of the tree, in the direction of the collapsed side of the old barn. He thought about what his father had told him once, years before, about dairy farms in this part of the county. Old dairy barns were built where the work was easiest, his father had said, not where the view was best. Cal had understood that to mean level ground, good access. But standing there with his stakes and string, he began to think it might have meant something else. A neighbor named Vernon Tate, who had farmed the adjacent property for 40 years, came by that Friday to return a borrowed post driver. Cal showed him the root pattern and the stakes. Vernon looked at the string line and at the 3 parallel furrows in the soil where the roots had displaced the ground slightly over the years. "Old tree roots do strange things," he said. "All 3 of them?" Cal said, "Probably an old drainage ditch," Vernon said, and went home. A drainage ditch would have explained the parallel direction. What it would not have explained was the temperature of the soil at the depression point, which Cal had measured again with a dairy thermometer he'd borrowed from Vernon's wife. The surrounding ground read 61 degrees in the afternoon. The dark patch near the root zone read 54. An old drainage ditch held rainwater. It did not stay 7 degrees colder than its surroundings 2 weeks after the last significant rain. The surveyor, when Cal mentioned it on the phone, said plainly that he had marked the tree as a hazard, and that if Cal was trying to find a reason to keep it, he was wasting time on something that would be down by its own weight within a few years. Cal drove his stakes and followed the line. At 68 feet from the tree, northwest, he came to a low area where the grass grew slightly taller and darker green than the surrounding ground. He was not certain this meant anything. It could have been a natural depression that collected rainwater, but the ground was not low here, not in the way a depression was low. It was level with the surrounding grade. Only the grass differed. He walked the area with a metal rod he used for testing fence post depth, pushing it into the ground at intervals. At most points it met resistance at 14 to 18 inches where the limestone subgrade began. At 3 points in a rough line through the green patch, the rod went in easily to 22 inches and stopped on something that gave a faint ring when he tapped it. He got down on his hands and knees and began clearing the sod by hand. Beneath the grass was a flat stone. Beneath that stone was another. He worked the second loose and found a third below it, and when he had cleared the area around all 3, he saw that they were not random fieldstone. They had been placed, each one fitted against the next, forming the top surface of a covered line running in the direction he had been following. He borrowed a longer spade from Vernon's shed and dug carefully alongside the line, not into it. At 14 inches below grade, the spade scraped something curved and hollow. He cleared the soil around it with his hands, a clay pipe, old, unglazed, the kind fired and laid in the 1910s or 1920s when municipal plumbing hadn't reached farm country and water systems were built from whatever a man could make or order from a catalog. The joint where 2 sections met was wrapped with what remained of a cloth seal, almost entirely deteriorated. Cal sat back on his heels and looked at the piece of pipe in the wall of the hole he'd dug. He drove to the county recorder's office that afternoon and asked to see whatever was on file for the property before it had been split from the larger original parcel. There were 3 plat maps, each from a different decade. On the oldest, drawn in 1938, a faint pencil line ran from a point in the north part of the property down toward the area near the barn site, and it was labeled in handwriting so small he had to use his glasses, field line, spring feed. The line went directly under the sycamore tree. Cal did not go back to the property that evening. He sat at the kitchen table with the photocopy of the old plat and a flashlight and thought about what the line meant. A spring feed line was not a well. It was a gravity system, bringing water from a higher point down to where it was needed, using clay tile or pipe and the slope of the ground to do what electricity and pumps did later. If the line had originally connected a spring on the higher ground to the north, and if the line was even partially intact, and if the spring was still producing anything at all, then the property's listing of no water source was not quite accurate. It was a water source that had been buried and forgotten. He drove the line systematically over the next 2 weeks, not in one day. In sections, following the stone cover to where it ended, probing with the rod, clearing sections of sod by hand, and then refilling them. The line ran 290 feet from the tree to a point near the northeast corner of the old barn foundation. At several points, the clay pipe had collapsed or been severed, almost certainly by the equipment that had graded the access road sometime in the 1970s. At 310 feet, the line ended against a buried concrete block. Cal thought this was the terminus, the dead end he'd been building toward, and he sat on the block for a while with the distinct feeling of having followed something all the way to the wrong conclusion. Then he looked at the block more carefully. It was not a building block, it was a trough. A small concrete watering trough, cracked on one end where ground movement had shifted it, but mostly intact, buried to within 4 inches of its rim by decades of accumulated soil and debris. He started digging it out. The trough had an inlet pipe entering from the uphill side, which was where the clay line terminated, and an overflow notch cut into the downhill rim. The inlet was packed with silt. The trough itself was dry. Cal spent a full day cleaning the inlet, working a snake line through the clay pipe sections that were still whole, clearing the silt from the blocked joints, rebuilding the pipe cover where sections had cracked and settled. He worked backward from the trough toward the tree, doing what he could without heavy equipment, skipping the severed sections that would need to be replaced with modern pipe later. 3 days after he finished cleaning the sections he could reach, it rained. Not heavy. 1.5 inches over 6 hours, the kind of rain that moved through the county and left the road cuts dripping for 2 days. On the second morning after the rain, Cal walked out to the trough. There was water in it, not much. 1 inch, maybe 1.5 inches, standing clear in the bottom of the old concrete basin. But it was there, and it was clear, and it was cold in the way limestone water was cold, and it had not been there before the rain. He knelt at the trough for a while and did not say anything. The clay inlet line was still passing water. Damaged in places, reduced in flow by the broken sections he hadn't been able to repair, but passing water. Somewhere uphill, behind the old barn foundation, water was entering the system. Not a spring in the sense of an open pool, a seep, a slow exfiltration from the limestone that had been feeding this line for decades after the farm stopped using it, the way water kept doing what it had been doing, long after anyone remembered why. The financial accounting on the back of an envelope was not complicated. A drilled well in that part of Ozark County ran between $7,800 and $9,400, and that was assuming the driller found water at a reasonable depth in ground, where limestone sometimes meant 200 feet of dry hole before anything useful appeared. Water hauling at $35 a load, for the number of dry weeks that county typically saw in a summer, added up to somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 a season. The pipe repair, the new sections, the rubber couplings, the trough restoration, the storage tank, and the gravity line to the calf lot had run Cal $1,240 in materials and 2 weeks of his own time. The system did not match a drilled well in reliability or volume. He was clear about that, but for 14 calves through one dry summer, it was what he had needed, and it had cost what he could afford. He found the plank in the barn. It was in the northwest corner of the standing section, nailed to a rafter at shoulder height, a piece of oak board that had stayed dry under the roof while everything around it deteriorated. The words on it were burned into the wood with a hot iron, not written, which was why they were still legible. Water line, keep open. Cal was not a sentimental man. He stood under the board for a few minutes and then went back outside. He spent the rest of the summer repairing the line in sections. He replaced the 3 broken spans with modern ABS pipe connected to the original clay with rubber couplings, laid proper gravel around the new sections, and rebuilt the trough cover with treated lumber and a removable hatch. By August, the trough was filling to about 8 inches after significant rain and recovering to 3 or 4 inches within 2 days of a dry spell. It was not enough to water a herd from directly, and he was clear with himself about that. He added a storage tank connected to the trough overflow and a gravity line to the calf lot, which moved the water from where the system delivered it to where he actually needed it. The storage system gave him enough for 14 calves through a dry August, when the ponds on both neighboring properties dropped to standing puddles. Vernon Tate came by in September and stood at the trough. He looked at the water, then at the tree. It wasn't dying, Vernon said. No, Cal said. What was it doing? Cal thought about the 3 roots running parallel in the same direction, and the pale leaves on the northwest side of the canopy, and the soft spot where his brush cutter had dropped into damp soil the previous spring. Drawing on what the line was still delivering, he said, better than anything else out there could reach. Vernon was quiet for a moment. How long do you think it's been working like that? He asked. Since they stopped using the line, Cal said. So probably 40 years. The sycamore did not recover fully. The dead sections of the trunk were still dead, and the hollow on the south side was still there, and the bark was still peeling from the upper third. But the northwest canopy came in better the following spring than it had in years, and the tree was still standing. Cal did not take it down. The surveyor had marked the tree as dead based on what he could see. He had not marked what was alive underneath it. The county record still said no well of record, no pond, no developed livestock water. In the strictest sense, it was still true. There was no well, there was no pond. There was a clay pipe, 100 years old in places, running 300 feet through limestone ground to a buried concrete trough in the corner of a falling-down barn lot, and a sycamore tree that had been drinking from it quietly for the better part of 4 decades while the property changed hands, and the records went blank and the listings stayed dry. The system did not give Cal water to waste. It gave him enough water to manage. In the dry years that followed, that was the difference that mattered. If you've ever seen a tree or a plant marking something underground that the maps had already forgotten, leave it in the comments below. These systems are still out there, and most of them are still pointing at something.